Hi all, I have another amazing game to show you from TCEC Season 19, Premier Division. So this is Stockfish playing against Fire. Let's have a look at this game. So the opening set, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. We have a Ruy Lopez. Knight f6, after white castling. Now we have bishop c5, c3, black castles, d4, bishop b6, rook e1, d6, h3. We have bishop d7, and this is the end of the book here. So a very interesting start position. Stockfish now plays a4. So sometimes there will be a threat, well, there is a threat rather, of bishop takes and a5 trapping the bishop. Black reacts with a6, and we have the bishop going to c4. Rook e8. Now this does neglect the f7 square for a moment, and this is tested with knight g5, this neglect. Rook f8, and the knight goes back, and the rook goes back, and the knight goes back. The rook goes back, but now it's not a threefold repetition. Stockfish varies now with bishop e3. And one question you might have, what about h6, kicking the knight back, and isn't there knight takes e4? Well, black actually played queen e7 here. If h6, knight f3, knight takes e4, in fact, white can play d5 here. And this is kind of bad for black. After bishop takes, rook takes, there's two knights hanging. The best black can do is knight takes f2, a desperado tactic, hitting the queen. But white ends up better here. For example, this position, there's at least a small advantage here, being a piece up for a few pawns, a couple of pawns. But if we go back here, so h6, knight f3, knight takes e4. If knight e7, this is far more clear cut. Just bishop takes b6 unveils the attack on e4, and there's been structural damage. That's a big advantage for white. Okay, so this does mean that h6 and knight f3 is not a very good idea. So queen e7 is played, and then we have the knight going back here. And the same kind of mechanisms are still relevant. Black can't really take on e4. Black played e takes d4 instead. If knight takes e4, d5 again, the same mechanism. And if bishop takes here, for example, this is a big advantage for white. In fact, there's the technical move queen d4, making use of the pin, and white's got a big advantage there. And in this position, if we look at this with knight d8, again, the same mechanism. So it's worth knowing this mechanism. So anyway, we have e takes d4, which releases a bit of the central tension. And sometimes the strategies in the Ruy Lopez do hinge on this bishop being kind of liberated later. This is the Spanish bishop. And it's important to manage this well and its career prospects. It can often be the key to the success playing with the white pieces. If white had played c takes, in fact queen takes e4 is actually possible here. d5, for example, queen takes c4. So it's important to play bishop takes d4 now. And then we have bishop a7. You might ask, what about knight takes here? Just bishop takes and knight bd2, and this is uncomfortable for black. After bishop d5, that pin is pretty nasty on e4 here. And if black has to give up the queen, that's not very good at all. White has a clear advantage there. So bishop a7, and we have bishop takes, rook takes, bishop f1. So watch out for this Spanish bishop. We have rook going to a8 there, rook a to a8, c4. So setting up a Morocco bind. However, are there corresponding dark square weaknesses? White does have a grip on light squares at the moment. We have a5, knight c3, bishop e6, and now knight d5 is played. Queen d8. It's good to do queen d8 here. If bishop takes, strongest it turns out in this position is to play c takes rather than e takes. This structure is pretty favourable for white. For example, like this, where white controls the board, basically, and can switch the rook even like this. That's devastating. And if black doesn't play materialistically. White just enjoys that greater mobility here after rook c3. So say knight f4, the queen could be kicked back, and eventually white can set up an attacking position with not only the options of rook g3, but looking at c7, it's pretty unpleasant, you know, maybe even trebling later on c7. So that's a pretty unpleasant structure set up for the backward c7 pawn. So structurally, yes. If e takes, just for those interested, this actually isn't so convincing at all, this structure. There isn't a backward c7 pawn to expose on the c file. So this should be only a small edge for white, if there's any edge. So queen d8 was played here anyway, not going for a structural change. And we have a rook left anyway, rook a3 here. Very interesting rook left, rook a3, knight d7. And the rook joins the other rook, so doubling there behind this pawn. But now, yeah, the Spanish bishop is not very happy right now, surely, with all these pawns on light squares. It's not very liberated. We have knight c5, b3, yet another light square weakness. f6. So why f6? I can only give a theoretical demo of why f6 might be important. So it starts with rook e8. This is just a theoretical demo, where white might be able to, if black does nothing much, then white might be able to arrange f4, f5, f6 with a form pawn, but it's only a theoretical sequence. So maybe that's why that kind of plan, though, could be on the cards potentially if black does nothing. So with the f pawn to increase the advantage. So f6, we have bishop e2, bishop f7, queen d2, we have knight e5, knight d4. So plans are afoot with this f pawn. c6, knight c3, queen b6, rook g3. We have bishop e6 now. You might wonder in this position, hold on, isn't b3 a problem? If knight takes b3, can you see what white can play here? If I give you 10 seconds to pause video, white to play and win, really. Okay. White has a really important tactical shot in this case with rook takes g7, and if king takes, then knight f5 and queen h6, and that's devastating. It's going to be checkmating. If we look at this again after rook takes g7, because it is kind of fascinating, if king h8, the damage is done, and for example like this, knight e6, now threatening rook takes and queen g7 mate, so the common square of g7 is celebrated, and this is just, you know, the common square of g7. So there's not much to do here after knight e6. If rook g8, rook takes h7, as mentioned. So what does black do there? That's very troublesome indeed. So rook takes g7 would be a major blow under all circumstances there. So we have actually that ignored then. So bishop e6, which covers the f5 square against this, you know, killer knight f5. We have bishop d1 now, officially protecting the pawn. And the Spanish bishop, has it got ambitions from d1 in this structure, where a lot of the pawns are still on light squares, kind of hemming it in? As Simple Chess, Michael Steen says, you know, the pawns are the fundamental constraint on the pieces. Here, the Spanish bishop is pretty constrained right now. We have it maneuvering, though, wriggling to c2. So is there a plan to open up this bishop on this diagonal? We have that bishop going back. The corresponding bishop hasn't got such an ambition here. It resides on a diagonal which, relative to white's diagonal, this is seems a bit more dangerous, h7 rather than h3. So we have knight e2, queen b4, queen c1, knight f7, knight f4, king h8, knight h5. Some common squares are emerging here on g7. Queen d1, delicate maneuvering, knight d7, and the rook goes back here. g6, this is kind of prompted, it seems. Why g6 now? First there was f6, and then there's g6. Why? If this is just a theoretical continuation, but maybe f4. And if black does nothing, this is just the demo. e5, which opens up that bishop. This could spell trouble. For example, like this. Knight takes g7. Queen g4 check. Queen h4. And all of a sudden, the Spanish bishop finds a common square with the important queen for mating on h7. I did say h7 seems a lot more significant than h3 in this whole Spanish game. If the bishop can get some support, this is going to be a killer bishop. For example, like this, even if it has to give itself up, this is just a wonderful position right here, why it's crashing through even here with this e6. There's all sorts of trouble. So for example, like this, e6 and e takes. There's a lot of trouble there in that position. If we go back here, so say, just testing if black does nothing. Yeah, just have a look at this again. So a knight sack and queen h4 crashing through. Yeah, this is enough, getting quite a lot of pawns, this position, and a lot of pawn potential for e6, and still a lot of king safety issues. Yeah, it's difficult to see what black is doing here. Black's getting kind of run over. And note also there's queen f6 and rook g3 as ideas in this position, which is why the queen wants to come back here and give back a piece. So, okay, so there's a case for playing this g6. So the position here seems to be softening up. We have here knight g3, knight c5, and now a nifty move. Can you guess what was played here? It's kind of nifty. Okay, queen a1. Yeah, looking at that newly weakened kind of diagonal, all this softening going on. Queen b6, f4 now. Maybe there are plans afoot here to open up the bishop. The rook goes there. Now king h1, knight a6. And we have now queen c3, queen b4, queen a1. Some playing around, dancing with the queens. And going to b2 now. And the rook goes back. And here, now queen c3, b6. So a change of tune here for black. Not using the queen so much. A bit of shuffling. And the bishop doesn't seem as though it's going to be doing anything for the moment. Rook e3, knight c5. Here, if bishop d7 instead, because knight c5, there's a question around this knight c5. Doesn't it allow ignite b4 as a possibility? So what if it was left there on a6? Because it does seem to be restricting key squares. If it was left there, then knight df5 all of a sudden is an interesting idea with knight h5. And look at this cooperation on f6. Maybe the bishop's not needed in this variation because these guys are pretty dangerous. Rook, queen, and knight, for example, like this is crashing through. And what does black actually do in this scenario? It's a pretty tricky one. If knight e5, that's pretty desperate after check. Rook g7, this is actually really dangerous. If the rook is challenged, for example, like this, knight takes f6 crashing through. And that threatens rook takes h7 mate if the queen moves. So that's devastating. So yeah, some very interesting variations arise on bishop d7. And you might think, well, hold on, what if it's not taken? Then knight h4 and f5. And this is interesting, where both knights are kind of getting an aggressive position there with an advantage for white. So fascinating stuff. So we have this knight c5 move, and now bishop c2. So there's a distinct possibility of b4, which kind of creates a backward pawn on the file, potentially. Rook f3, though, is played here, and a bit more shuffling. But now, indeed, this option is taken up. The bishop is supporting against knight takes a4 now. So we have this backward pawn, and the effect of this is really quite interesting. Sometimes we have certain insecurities about playing moves like e5 or f5. We're leaving weaknesses behind. And this is not the right moment to be playing a move like e5. Black is adequately protected. But if this b6 pawn can distract some of the defensive resource out of the equation, then maybe the e5 or f5 breaks, or both, could be a little bit more effective. We see this knight making way now from the king side to the queen side to this transference of energy, of defensive power. Is that a bit dangerous for black to do this? We have queen c3. Here this is significantly better anyway, this position. I mean, it remains better if the climate of the position is better. So queen c3 though. And the knight does transfer though. This is a radical idea, isn't it? The knight transferring leaving the king a bit barer without so many defensive resources around. So this seems controversial at an intuitive level. We see rook df1 and the knight coming to a5. But here, surely the king has an issue with that knight just departing over there to a5. And in fact, now Stockfish commits with f5. So you might think there's a whole downside which would put off a lot of human players here about f5, that big e5 square. Surely this is just impossible from a positional perspective. My good friend Paul Georgiou once said, you know, when you play such moves, you kind of accept their downsides. But here also, there's something instructive about what's going on with e5 as well. We do want to potentially liberate. What this could be about is not just giving up the square in the short run. The longer term, pardon me, that arrow's in the wrong place. The longer term idea, the Spanish bishop is the key driver of all the events. It's the fundamental premise, I believe, behind any micro events, which might have micro downsides like giving up key squares. The whole premise is to liberate this bishop. This is the key piece. This is key to the position. In many positions in the Ruy Lopez, this is key to the position. We have a move which, for the moment, seems to betray the bishop, putting yet another pawn on a light square, as well as betraying in general the white position, giving black the e5 square. Is this madness? f5. It does threaten to soften a little bit more technically the black king, which has already been kind of softened with the knight here now. So there is a little upside, and in fact this tickling is played. F takes, tickling, shaking a bit. Only 2 pawns around the king now, and a knight over here. And here, guess what white plays in this position? If I give you 10 seconds to pause the video, which seems to kind of self-manage one's own created downsides and emphasize the importance. It emphasizes the importance of the Spanish bishop. So this move, 10 seconds, what would you play here? Okay, e5. Of course, Stockfish has calculated all this to make sure this is possible. So what is going on here? This blasts open the bishop finally on this diagonal in the main line of the game. Now, f takes is played. If we look at d takes for a moment, then bishop takes is actually possible. If e takes, queen takes, and the queen is threatening to slide along here, and the knight's threatening also to help. So, for example, like this, knight h5, and look at f6. For example, this position, and the rooks can come in. That's losing the knight there, and this is devastating. But otherwise, this looks pretty devastating. If knight d7, for example, which looks more sensible, right? Rook g3, and c5, for example, here. Yeah, you might think, well, why is black giving up a rook just to exchange off queens there? The thing is, after c5 here, if b takes, then rook e1, and white's got some extra options with this continuation, like this diagonal sometimes might be useful with the knights if the knights are not on it. But also, the thing is, after rook e1, this is a devastating attack. Bishop h7 check. Double check. That's the key thing. It's a double check. And rook g7 is winning the queen, for example. And this is absolutely devastating. So yeah, it's quite a lot of impact to black's king safety in these lines. So let's go back. So e5 d takes doesn't seem that convincing. In a nutshell, let's just recap that. Bishop takes g6. And it doesn't matter about losing a piece here. There's no queen e3 check. The rook's on f2. And the queen's threatening things like h4. And the knight's threatening h5 to hit f6. And if there's a chance to liberate also the c-pawn to get some extra squares, that could be used. If black doesn't do this seemingly silly knight takes c4, just to recap, then rook g3, this rook left, this represents a crushing, attacking position, essentially. So anyway, so f takes is played. And now we have bishop takes anyway. So we have similar looking, in a way, positions. Rook takes, rook f8. If black dares to take on d4 here, queen takes d4 and bishop takes e8, and now queen f6 is strong. For example, check, check, and taking off the knight. If the knight doesn't enter the fray on c4, then white is threatening all sorts of things anyway, like queen g5, knight h5, rook f3 to g3. It's a desperate position. So we have rook f8 being played. Rook takes, queen takes. Now knight f5. And black plays bishop takes f5 here. If knight e6, it turns out c5 is a useful move in this position. For example, here, queen takes e5 is undermining and crashing through the diagonal. So that is pretty emphatic. And if b takes, that drops the knight on a5. So yeah. And if knight b7, then queen f3, looking at both sides of the board, doing some devastation. For example, like this is pretty devastating with knight e7 check there. So yeah, we have bishop takes f5, queen f3 using the pin here, and now bishop takes. Black's king is in trouble. The knight's protecting the bishop, and there's queen g4 for queen takes c4 if knight takes. We have king f6, queen h5, king e7, and now actually white transitions into a better ending. Black, yeah, giving up that pawn. There's two connected passed pawns here to win this ending with. After all that drama, we have this position, just a pawn up, but it's two connected passed pawns. So here, Stockfish is able to start using these pawns now, these two connected passed pawns, the bishop holding the pawns comfortably against the knight, and winning c6 now. Yeah, black's just lost, basically. It's over, bar the shouting, and resigned here. So, for me personally, I took away some philosophical points that we can see at this level in the Spanish game. That Spanish bishop maybe is the driver, the key driver of certain strategies and the underlying tactics of opening up the position. Just liberate the bishop to get at the opponent's king. So it's essentially an attacking opening, as long as you can liberate the Spanish bishop. That key diagonal seemed very, very dangerous and logical compared to black's light square bishop, which only looks at h3. So maybe that is one of the key secrets of the Spanish game, the Spanish bishop and its liberation potential. And when we give up squares, we create downsides, but can we neutralize them by later just playing e5 ourselves? So black doesn't actually take hostage of a key square of a piece. We don't let the opponent do that. We just play e5 in time. So you've played f5, which softens. So you have all the upsides and without all the downsides of giving away a key square to an outpost piece. Instead, e5 means even more pressure. It meant even more pressure against the black king here. So the whole mechanisms of f5 and e5 in conjunction with the Spanish bishop, I found kind of fascinating and instructive. I hope you did too. If you enjoyed this game, please also check out my new course at Udemy, Kingscrusher TV/Opening Tango. And I like explaining ideas as well, not just variations, as I hope you get some evidence from this video. So my course is quite a lot of that philosophical content is in the course content as well of Opening Tango there, Kingscrusher TV, Opening Tango. If you want to check out my playlist, bit.ly/leave the chess. There is also bit.ly/stockfish chess. There's a small chat at Kingscrusher TV/Discord. And if you want to challenge me for a game at Chess Mold, bit.ly/chess mold, register and I'll be able to invite you for a game 5 days a move. Okay, comments, questions, like, shares, subscribes with the notification bell, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.